Welcome to MSBA's Always Bored, Never Boring, the podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to MSBA's first podcast covering legislative topics for our upcoming 2026 legislative session. I'm Melissa Randol. I'm the Executive Director of the Missouri School Boards Association. And joining us today, we have the Senior Director of Advocacy, Whaley, who's our expert and going to give us an overview of what she sees ahead of us the next 5 to 6 months. So welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you, Melissa. Excited to be here. Excited to start another year of legislating.
Well, let's just get right to it.
Yeah.
All right. Why don't you briefly cover where we've been? So cover where the legislature left off this last session.
Yeah, I like to say I'm wishing for a normal year, but I've yet to have one in Jefferson City.
How do you define normal, right?
Right? I don't know. It's been so long since we've had a normal one. So the legislature last year had their standard January through May legislative session. During that, they passed 51 bills, which they've kind of been in a cycle of passing fewer bills, but having a lot of big omnibus bills. So that number seems pretty low, but certainly shouldn't be any indication that they passed less sections of law or changes. There were several bills that kind of really impacted K-12, with the main one I think that we've talked a lot about is the Senate Bill 68, which focuses on safety and improving kind of baseline safety at schools across the state. Some other kind of big ones that passed during regular session was the elimination of the capital gains tax. Mm-hmm. The legislature also made changes to the voter-passed. It wasn't a constitutional change. It was a referendum on increasing the minimum wage and establishing sick leave, and they eliminated the provision that required employers to provide sick leave, and then they also changed the minimum wage. What voters passed would not have impacted public schools, and this, as the legislature changed it, it does impact public employers. So that was something that happened. We also passed a budget as we're required to every year. Some highlights of the budget were we did get a fully funded formula, which was very exciting. We weren't kind of sure how that was going to shake out after the governor didn't recommend fully funding the formula. We got fully funded transportation. They funded the baseline teacher salary grant. We were disappointed to see that for the first time in Missouri, there was general revenue put into the voucher program, the Missouri Empowerment Scholarship Program. That decision is under litigation. So I think we're all still waiting to see how that litigation shakes out as far as the allowability of putting general revenue into what was passed as a tax credit program initially. So that was kind of the regular session, and that was already enough. But they wanted more. So they came back not once, but twice to pass more. So that first special session that the governor called was to really the main point was they wanted to pass stadium incentives to try and keep the Chiefs and Royals in Missouri. So that was passed, but also tagged on to that bill was a really crazy property tax policy where essentially the senators got together and just raised their hands on how they wanted property tax increases to happen in counties in their districts. So you had some counties that are not affected at all, current status quo, some counties that had a 5% cap on increases, and some counties that had a no increase are not allowed. So that's also under litigation. But pending what happens with that litigation, we will start seeing the county votes to approve what kind of their senator said they wanted. Those will start happening in the spring, so it's right around the corner. Then the final special session, they took up and passed a new congressional map for Missouri. Normally that's only done every 10 years, after we get a new census. But they passed a new congressional map, kind of at the urging of the president. And then they also made some proposed changes to initiative petition reform. So the former, the congressional map, also under litigation.
A lot of lawsuits going on right now.
Man, we are keeping the lawyers busy. And the second, the initiative petition reform, is also under litigation, but beyond that, it will have to go to a vote of the people because it is impacting the people's ability to make changes to the Constitution. So that was a lot in 2025.
Yeah. So typically we have general session that's
Right.
January through mid-May, and then we have veto session that's in September, right?
Right.
So this last year we had 2 extra special sessions tacked on with some pretty high-profile pieces of legislation that passed both times.
Yeah, and I would say not every year, but there has seemed to be a steady increase in the frequency of these, quote, special or extraordinary sessions. I've been working in the legislature for 12, 13 years, and it definitely feels like they're becoming more common as ways to, things that get close, but people really want in a general session, they don't quite have the opportunity to tackle. A special session is usually called by the governor, and he can very narrowly tailor the call, what they're there to do. So they have this like laser focus on whatever they're trying to get done. And I mean, usually they get it done.
Talk a little bit more about that. You said that the governor, when the governor calls a special session, he tailors it to a particular topic. So if I'm a legislator and I want to bring up a topic that's not within the call of the governor, can I during special session?
So you can, there's not really any way to prohibit them from filing the legislation, normally, ideally, the governor has kind of coordinated with House and Senate leadership, and they're kind of all on the same page with what is or is not moved. But that's also somewhat fluid because the governor can always amend his call. So in the instance of the stadium, that was as it became clear that they were going to have to do something with property taxes,
to get the stadium bill passed.
So it's kind of a squishy thing. If there's a staunch enough opposition, but they can be kind of negotiated with to get on board with whatever they really want. Sometimes they'll expand a call. So it's kind of an somewhat untested question. But in general, that's kind of the rules that we live by.
Got it. So in September, we had a little bit of controversy during that special session, and there's some discussion that we may still feel some of that controversy with particularly with senators as we move into the 2026 session.
Yeah, I think looking towards 2026, based on what happened in 2025, there's going to be a lot of headwinds working against maybe some leadership priorities, working against kind of the functionality of the bodies. Now, I will caveat this with, we kind of say that every year because, like I mentioned at the beginning, I just want a regular session, but nobody quite knows what that looks like. So, like you mentioned, there are definitely some hard feelings after the second special session. There were some procedural tactics deployed by Republican leadership that I'll call new. Mm-hmm. So one of them that I'll specifically highlight, they quite literally threw out the rule book during the special legislative session and rewrote it to kind of overcome the filibuster, because we still have a filibuster in Missouri, a true filibuster where, members can stand up and talk and they don't have to yield the floor. So that is one of the primary tactics that Democrats in a superminority use in Missouri to prevent Republican priorities from passing. So to kind of circumvent that, they rewrote the rules to make the first thing on the agenda the thing they wanted to do. And quite literally over the very vocal objections of some Democrat senators on the floor who, felt like they were trying to be recognized, which they should have been. Their objections they did not feel like were properly handled. So I think there's definitely some hard feelings there with the Democratic caucus in the Senate. Additionally, after that special session, the Speaker pro tem of the Senate made a change to the chair of the Budget Committee. So it had previously been Senator Lincoln Huff from Springfield, and he's been a great advocate for public education. She did make a change to that chairmanship, and I think he's been pretty vocal about his frustration with that change and feeling like that was a punitive move for decisions that he had made. And so I don't know how that's going to factor in kind of to the legislative session. And then just overall, it's an election year.
It's an election year.
It's a midterm election year, and people do weird stuff in election years. Most of the time, I can pretty confidently predict how somebody is going to vote on something, but election years kind of throw wrenches into that. I think a great example of that will be how is House Speaker Jonathan Patterson going to handle some of the topics that are going to come up that are kind of red meat issues. He's a Republican. He's from Lee Summit. He's running for Senate in a pretty purple district. He voted, for example, against the congressional map. Even though it was, brought up in a chamber he was presiding over, he did vote against it. So I think that's an example of how elections shape voting. And I don't know, I think if you followed it all on a national level, how voting has shifted in special elections and elections held this year, it's been a hard shift to the left. You've seen districts, like congressional districts, shift in the double digits to the left from where they were in the 2024 election presidential cycle. And so I'm quite confident that people are watching that and thinking about how that factors into their decision going into an election year.
All right, well, let's talk about when this fun gets started in 2026. When does the session begin? Walk us through what we can expect in January.
Yeah, so we're already into pre-filing. So Monday, December 1st was the first day that legislators could file their bills, and boy, did they.
How many were filed that day?
The very first day, they filed 1,084 bills, which is crazy. I think if we keep that pace, we are well on our way to the most bills ever filed in the General Assembly. So, like I said, pre-filing opened December 1st. January starts January 7th. So it's always the first Wednesday after the first Monday in January. So it moves a little bit, but that's kind of the rule that they live by. There's not as much. It's the second term because it's an election year. That means it's the second term of a General Assembly session. So there shouldn't be a lot of changes at this point in chairmanships after we had a couple. Sometimes that means it gets off to a quicker start. Sometimes it has no impact. It all depends on kind of how the flow gets going with the pro tem in the Senate and the Speaker referring bills to committees and getting committee hearings started. Sometimes we have bill hearings the second week. Sometimes we don't have bill hearings for 3 weeks, 4 weeks.
Now, we've already had a Senate Ed committee hearing just this week, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it wasn't on a bill specifically, but the Senate Education Committee met on December 4th. They wanted to talk to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education about APR scores. So APR scores came out a few weeks ago. DESE was really pleased with the progress that they saw on those scores, both in growth and, in kind of performance. The Senate had a different perspective, and they wanted to kind of talk that out. So it wasn't an open hearing in the sense that there was public testimony, but they did ask Commissioner Esslinger and some of her team to come in and talk to them. And I think it was a conversation kind of back and forth with the Senate Education Committee trying to gain some understanding on DESE's perspective and DESE trying to share a little bit deeper. APR scoring, as someone who has only been in education policy for a few years, it is not for the faint of heart. And so I understand there is definitely a learning curve.
You're saying it's complicated, right?
A bit. And it's a spreadsheet that kind of, it can make your eyes cross if you don't know what you're looking for. So I certainly won't be the last conversation with DESE. I'm certain about APR scores. I think as it's been the last few years, education is going to continue to be a big topic of conversation in the upcoming session.
Well, let's talk about what are those topics. Education obviously is one of them. What are some of the topics within education do you think will bubble up? And what are the other big things that are going to drive the General Assembly this session?
Yeah, so I think it's going to be kind of some of the main topics that we've been talking about year after year. I think we're going to see open enrollment is going to be a huge topic this year. And you know as well as I that there are a lot of moving parts right now in education, and it's a big administrative thing to conceptualize. No matter what you feel about it, it is a huge shift in education policy, and with on the kind of the cusp of a potential formula rewrite, with a lot of conversations about taxes, which I'll talk about in a minute. I just don't think it's the right time to have that conversation. Our schools are navigating so much financially, administratively. To put something else on them is really, I think, just too much to ask at this point.
Yeah. And of course, MSBA's position on open enrollment is that we do not support open enrollment in general unless certain conditions are met, and Missouri has yet to file a bill that had all those conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we will continue to kind of stand and defend the interest of schools that, it's just not right for Missouri, and especially not right now with all of those factors at play. Another topic that I'm certain is going to come up is expansion of charter schools. Right now, with the exception of Boone County, who got its own special law, charters can only be expanded in when there's, a subpar kind of accreditation status, and there's not any schools that currently are in that, which was a point of contention at the DESE hearing, at the Senate Education hearing this week. But I do think that people are going to look to expand, to create new ways for charters to exist outside of those categories. And while we, accept that charters are public schools, we do not agree that charters should just be able to exist. They have got to come with accountability. There have been really great proposals introduced from like Senator Maggie Nernberg from the Kansas City area about requiring charters to kind of, before they can open, they have to file a certificate of need, which that's a thing in hospitals right now,
right.
But it's not a thing in charters, and it should be. It requires, they have to demonstrate that there's a need in the community, that there's capacity to not only have students attend, but enough teachers and staff to, exist, that they are financially solvent, that they have a good plan. So she's been a wonderful advocate in that space. And so, I think that's a legislation that we'll certainly be supporting this year. There's already legislation filed to expand access to the voucher program, to remove some of the conditions under kind of the limiting conditions under which students can access the voucher program. And on top of that, the state treasurer, who is the administrator in government over the voucher program, has already said he's going to ask for an additional $50 million of general revenue, bringing the total to $100 million. So that's going to be a big fight, is how to handle that. It was the $50 million was pretty contentious last year, but ultimately made it. And I don't know how people will handle, another $50 million. We've seen minimal data, to be generous, about that program and how it's impacted, other than the vast majority of the funding is going to religious schools out of that program.
So, Caitlin, when it comes to whether it's charters or vouchers, the real issue, the real rub is the accountability. When
Absolutely.
You're using taxpayer dollars for educating, spending money on education that comes from Missouri's taxpayers, they have a right to know how their money's being spent, right? And parents have a right to know and compare the education systems. And that's what's missing right now in Missouri's laws for both vouchers and charters.
Yeah.
Complete accountability.
And I don't think anyone can deny that we have a lot of hoops we ask public schools to jump through when it comes to reporting out information. They are held accountable by a publicly elected board. They have, a ton of data that they're providing to the Department of Elementary and Secondary. And if you dislike the format or whatever you can't deny that it's there.
Right.
I think our position is there should be there should be parity.
Yes.
For other institutions that are taking public dollars to educate kids. They should be held to the same standards of public disclosure, of reporting,
safety.
Absolute keeping their kids safe, serving all kids.
Yes.
That's a huge one for us is, are you truly serving all kids? And I think, we want to make sure that every kid has a high quality education, and that includes children that are, that are navigating disabilities or have IEPs. And unfortunately, those kids don't always have the same access to these schools that are accepting public dollars.
Yes. All right, let's talk about another topic that's made quite a few headlines, especially the last few months, and that's state revenue.
Yeah.
That no fun to talk about, but
not fun, but always interesting. And November revenue numbers came out this week, and I was shocked.
Yeah.
I think I had been telling people for months, brace for impact. It's going to be a hard year, and it still could be. It's still only 5 months into the fiscal year, so the state fiscal year runs July to June. So we're only 5 months in with those November revenue numbers, but pretty strong. I mean, revenue numbers for November came in 16.2% over 2024, which is a crazy number.
Yeah.
So that brings the year-to-date total to 4.3% over fiscal year 2025, which is, I hate state budget year numbers. It always throws me. But that's a pretty strong number. I think a lot of people were anticipating 0.5% to 1%. And I'll be interested to see how that's factored into the consensus revenue estimate. So that the consensus revenue estimate, for those of us that aren't nerds, is the number that the legislature uses to create Missouri's balanced budget. So we have to have a balanced budget in Missouri, and the consensus revenue estimate is when House leadership, Senate leadership, and the governor's kind of budget leadership in the office administration sit down together and agree what balanced is for the coming year. So they set a number, and that's kind of the number of that's the number they use to decide how big the budget can be. So, I'll be interested to see that CRE, as it's known, should be coming out anytime in the next couple weeks. And it'll be interesting to see if they are very conservative in their estimate and say, we're going to do 1% or 2% growth, or if they kind of stick along with what the number is looking like right now.
And so that consensus revenue estimate, the governor's office typically takes that and builds a proposed budget and releases that during the state of the state, right?
Yes.
Releases that proposed budget. And then the legislature doesn't necessarily have to take that budget, but it's guidelines on the governor's priorities,
Yeah,
right?
so the way the budget timeline kind of works is on October 1st, all of the executive agencies submit their agency requests to the governor's office and the Office of Administration. Those two, then the governor's office and the Office of Administration take those, I'll say, under advisement, and then they make decisions based on their priorities, and they release their executive budget in January-ish, whenever they hold the state of the state that year. And you're right, then from there, the House, because the budget starts in the House, takes up whatever budget they're going to start with. Sometimes they start with the previous year's budget, sometimes they start with the governor's budget, and then it goes through the process of House subcommittees, House committee, House floor, and then it goes to the Senate, with all of that wrapping up the first Friday in May, because the budget deadline is just a little bit earlier than the end of the legislative session.
So a lot of work there this year. And another big topic that affects our revenue is taxes. You've already talked a little bit about property taxes and some of the actions that were taken during special session, but we also have a big announcement by the governor in terms of one of his priorities that could impact income taxes. What are your thoughts on taxes being a big topic during session?
I think taxes is going to be the topic during session. I think it's a complex issue, and it's an issue that everybody is talking about in one way or another. And you're right. There's a big push on the property tax front. There's a big push from the governor on the income tax front. Somebody made a comment to me a few weeks ago that it seemed like nobody has a plan. And I said, no, I think the problem is that everybody has a plan. And so I think, I do think that both of those will be on the watch list throughout session. And I don't know if one's going to win, if somebody's going to find a path forward for both of them. Obviously, property tax is incredibly important to schools, and we have been closely monitoring and engaging with other groups that are interested and focused on defending local services, local schools, and that funding stream, because that is what keeps Missouri schools afloat as 49th or 50th, depending on the year, in state support for public schools. Like, that is how our schools survive and exist. And that's why we're so worried about Senate Bill 3 and watching that lawsuit so closely. Yeah. And that's why we're going to be extremely involved in, advocating for why that funding is critical for public schools. And then, how the income tax factors into that. I haven't seen a definitive plan on either one, and the devil's always in the details on those. I know there's a lot of frustration around property taxes, and I've heard some things that are incredibly reasonable, about how to just make the system work better. But I've also heard things that are completely crazy. So, that's why it's just so important for us to stay in the mix and understand what is moving and isn't moving at any given time.
So our legislature can cut taxes. There are essentially no restrictions on cutting taxes. However, what if they cut too deep and need to increase taxes because Missouri can't, continue to devote the resources that are necessary to function? What happens then? Can the legislature increase taxes?
No. So people might remember a few years ago, Kansas did just that.
Exactly.
Kansas cut way too deep, and they really quickly went, oh my God, and they came back in and they kind of walked it back. We do not have that luxury in Missouri. Taxes above a very, very minimal threshold have to come through a vote of the people. So in a
statewide vote of the people.
Correct. So in a scenario in which we pass a crazy property tax thing, or we pass a crazy income tax thing, and we roll up, with a CRE next year of negative whatever, the only way to fix that problem is to have a statewide kind of ask of, hey, should we raise taxes? And if there is one thing I have learned time and time again, that is really, really hard to pass a statewide tax in Missouri. They are historically unpopular. So I do remain hopeful that there are enough reasonable heads in the legislature to recognize that you cannot just demolish local services through property taxes, and you cannot just demolish the main funding stream that runs state government, which is income taxes, independent of one another, let alone at the same time. You have to have a relatively stable, reliable source of income to put in its place. And not to say there aren't states that haven't done one or both things, but every state is different, and I haven't seen a plan that I'm like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense to me.
Yeah. I've heard a lot of talk about, well, we can rely more on sales tax or other forms of tax, but sales tax in particular is somewhat troubling for a state like Missouri when many of our economic hubs, Kansas City, St. Louis, even Springfield, Joplin, Cape, they're sitting very close to a border, or sitting right on the border with another state. So if you have a high sales tax, you could cross the border and pay something less, hurting Missouri's business.
Well, and, I've heard several people talk about replacing property taxes with sales tax.
Right.
But that doesn't work when you're not selling a whole lot in a given area.
Yes.
There are some counties where there's just not that much going on. And I have heard representatives and senators continue to bring that up, that like, hey, all I've got in my district is a Dollar General, a Casey's, and a McDonald's. Like, I can't survive. My district could never survive on sales tax alone. But, I remain hopeful. But I mean, just for context for the income tax and how much that means to Missouri, income tax in Missouri is just under 60% of state revenues. So we would have to find almost $8 billion to eliminate the income tax and not have any reduction in services.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people that want to cut these taxes they talk about reducing government size. So I think they're comfortable with reduction in services. But there are a lot of other people that when kind of pen meets paper on cutting things, cutting becomes much more unpopular.
Yes. Yeah. Because we actually see the services that are eliminated.
And you hear from people that are impacted by those services. And obviously there's a lot of cuts happening at the federal level too. So it's just stacking thing on top of thing.
Right. Okay, on that cheery note, you've talked a little bit about the behind-the-scene dynamics that are playing out this particular year, elections coming up next November. We've got some, with term limits, you're going to have some more turnover. Key positions, leadership positions are going to be termed out after this session. Talk us through what that means for what we can see the next 5 months.
Yeah, I think you'll see, so in the House, we'll start in the House, the House plans their leadership a lot farther in advance than the Senate does. So we pretty much already know, with almost certainty, that the next House Speaker will be Alex Riley from Springfield. But you have a current speaker in John Patterson, like I mentioned, that's running for Senate. So I don't know how that'll impact his decision-making kind of in bringing stuff forward. Obviously, I think it'll impact his voting, but we'll see if that flows through in his management at all. In the Senate, they run leadership races down to the wire. So Senator Cindy O'Loughlin is the current Speaker pro tem, and she's term limited. And Senator Tony Luetkemeyer is the majority leader, and he's term limited. I think you will see jockeying within the Republican caucus for the leadership races in the upcoming year. And there's kind of been two main factions in the Republican Party for the last almost 10 years. You have kind of the Freedom Caucus, and then you have kind of the other standard
or traditional
Republicans. Yeah. And the Freedom Caucus has been gaining ground over the years, and I know that they're trying to position themselves to take over a leadership position. They haven't done that before. They haven't held either of those two main leadership positions. So it'll be interesting to see how they interact with their colleagues and if they're trying to set themselves up to kind of take a leadership position in the coming session. And then you also have that new Senate budget chair. The new Senate budget chair is Senator Rusty Black. So he is not term limited. So he could, in theory, have a 3-year budget chairmanship. And then you have a term limited budget chair in the House, and that's also an incredibly powerful position that people want. Normally it goes to the vice chair. The vice chair of the budget committee is relatively new. He's only, after this year, he'll have been on budget for 2 years. So I think all of that will be interesting, on top of the other dynamics we talked about, like it being an election year, like kind of some of those lingering feelings from the special session. And I don't even pretend to predict how that's all going to play out.
And I won't put you on the spot. Let's talk a little bit about term limits for those who are new to watching the legislature here in Missouri. We do have a relatively unique term limit system in Missouri. So what are the caps on years you can serve in the House and in the Senate?
So in the House, it's 4 2-year terms. So the House is basically always running, always running for election.
Yeah.
And then in the Senate, it's 2 4-year terms. So 8 years in each body, 16 years total. And then you're out.
And you can't divvy those up. You can't spend 16 in one chamber.
You have 8, maximum of 8 in both. And we haven't had term limits for an incredibly long time, but I mean, it's been at least 20 years.
Yeah.
So, it's created, I am not personally a term limits fan, I think, but it's created it just creates different dynamics to have term limits like that. There are a couple bills this year filed to change that, so they kind of think about tinkering with the term limits almost every session.
It creates a lot of turnover, for sure,
Correct.
both in leadership as well as both bodies. So, all right. Are there any other things to share about the session? I know we're going to continue to do these podcasts. We'll have another one coming right up in January, and hopefully you'll give us some good news through session.
Yeah. Well, we'll for our MSBA members, we'll continue some of the advocacy programming in the coming year. But I think we did a pretty good job of diving in. It'll fingers crossed be quieter from now until the session starts, with people kind of focusing on the holidays and being home in their districts. But it'll be here before we know it.
It will be less than a month.
Yeah.
So we also have another group of elected officials that we care very deeply about, and that's our school board members. And filing opens for our incumbents as well as any other candidates who'd like to file to run for their local board. That opens December 9th and closes December 30th. So if you're interested, if you're an incumbent, don't forget, you need to file. Or if you're listening to this and you're interested in running, you have until the 30th of this month of December to file. So,
and I will just mention that if you are going to file, make sure you reach out to your local district and understand when their office is open, especially with the holidays. They're not always open, kind of the standard business hours. So just make sure you don't miss the filing window because you didn't check what time they were open.
This happens at a weird time of year with all the holidays, right?
Yeah.
So, it creates some confusion.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, Caitlin Whaley, our premier senior director of advocacy for the Missouri School Boards Association. Thank you. Thank you for this information today. We look forward to hearing from you again in next month. And get some rest because you'll need it come January. We appreciate you, and thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.